everyone, pleasure to be here. So yes, this is my real name, but I go by Kasia. And I'm here for 3 months in the Department of Communication Studies doing some research with Greg on strength perception from the voice. But today I'm going to talk about my PhD research, actually, which looked at human vocal communication of body size. So I'd like to start by giving a broad context in terms of the sort of multidisciplinary theoretical paradigm that has really inspired my research questions. And I think this will help to highlight the rationale and some of the implications of the work. And I'd also like to note that if anything is unclear, feel free to interrupt me and ask for clarification. Is my sound projecting okay back there? Good. So first and foremost, I study the voice as a tool that we use to navigate this incredibly complex and multifaceted cognitive, as well as, of course, social environment. And when I talk about social communication or vocal communication, I'm not only referring to the role of the voice in language, but in fact, most of my research focuses on nonverbal communication. So how we use the non-linguistic aspects of our voice to, say, communicate motivation, intent, or personal characteristics about psychological and physical traits of the speaker. I also study the voice from an evolutionary perspective. So you can think of it as, for example, a peacock's tail, or maybe more accurately, like the human body or the human face, which we think have been influenced by sexual selection. So in other words, I can think of the voice as a trait that's been shaped by male-male competition and female mate choice to provide fitness-relevant information to potential mates and rivals. And one of the key clues that the voice is, like the face and body, sexually selected in humans is the fact that it's highly sexually dimorphic. So there are very salient differences between men's and women's voices. And also the fact that it appears to play a really meaningful role in mate choice and in male-male competition, not only in lots of other animals, but also in humans. So that's some theoretical context to the way that I'm really approaching this question to vocal communication of size. Actually, there's been a ton of research in the past 20 years studying the voice from this evolutionary social perspective. And this research has shown that, in fact, there's a ton of information in the voice about personal characteristics of the vocalizer. We know, for example, as I've mentioned, with the voice being so sexually dimorphic, that there is very reliable information about sex in the voice, and that listeners are almost 100% accurate in identifying whether someone is a man or a woman from their voice alone. And of course, our voice also changes throughout the lifetime from birth to death. And people are very good also at reliably estimating age, usually within 5 or 10 years. More recent work suggests the voice also has information about health, fertility, ethnicity, physical strength, and social and physical dominance. And again, that listeners are to some extent able to estimate these characteristics from the voice. So my research, of course, as I've noted, focuses on perception of body size, both from the production and the perception side of things. So given all of the information, the social characteristics available in the voice, why have I focused on body size? And the answer is essentially that size really matters. Thank you, Clegg. Yeah. We know that in many animals, body size can explain a good deal of the variation, of course, in health, social, and reproductive success among individuals. For example, when we look specifically at these explicit male-male contests, when there is asymmetry in body size, it's almost always the case that the larger male wins the physical contest. And of course, in social species where we see dominance hierarchies, the most dominant male is typically the largest male, and he has access to the great territories, all the resources, and all the ladies. All the females typically prefer the large males. And we see this in mammals and fish and a lot of species, and in fact, also in humans. So body size does predict health, social, and reproductive success in many human cultures, particularly among men. Now, one caveat is that we do see some cross-cultural variation because, of course, environmental and life history factors can affect the trade-offs and costs and benefits of body size. But in general, and particularly in North America and Europe, we see this positive relationship between tallness and social and reproductive success. So again, we can look at these very explicit physical sorts of contests between males, where the larger guy is more likely to win. Or we can think about it, the more subtle effects of body size in human cultures and perception of body size in terms of, for example, political and economic outcomes. And this is because being tall, as I've mentioned, is tied to perceptions of leadership, competence, and social dominance. There is a lot of correlational data that's been done in North America and Europe that again suggests that taller guys make more money, have higher education, higher jobs, more attractive girlfriends, and more children. So it suggests that, at least in these cultures, being tall benefits men. And it's really no surprise then that men in leadership positions in the political and business spheres wish they were a little bit taller and tend to try to exaggerate their body size in various ways. That is, I think, the French president. Okay, so given all of these implications of body size and the sort of overarching importance of body size in human culture, we can think that it's probably advantageous to either honestly indicate your body size or to, in some cases, exaggerate your body size and to let it be known to others. And on the flip side, of course, it's also probably advantageous for listeners to be able to reliably judge a person's size from various modalities, including the voice. So we might typically think of communication of body size in the visual modality. You can look at somebody and typically tell how big they are, how much they weigh. But in a lot of animals, size is communicated vocally. And this also appears to be the case in humans. And the idea is, one possibility is that this vocal communication is emphasizing the visual cue. So it's sort of an additive or backup effect. The other possibility is that the vocal cues to body size can be used when visual cues fail. So for example, over long distances, or when the visual cues are exaggerated and not a reliable index of body size. Research on vocal communication of body size in humans and other mammals has focused on two key, very salient features of the human voice, or the mammalian voice. The first of these is fundamental frequency, which along with its harmonics we perceive as voice pitch. And this is produced by vibration of the vocal folds here within the larynx, which is, of course, in men, the Adam's apple. And in women, it's a little bit higher, so you can't quite see the protrusion. This little note is to remind me that throughout the talk, I'll be referring to fundamental frequency when I'm talking about the physical properties of the sound, and pitch when I'm talking about the perception. But they essentially are referring to this same quality in the voice. The second feature that's typically studied in the context of body size are formant frequencies. And these are related roughly to the perception of vocal timbre or quality. And they're produced by filtering of the supralaryngeal vocal tract, or essentially they are resonances of the vocal tract. Everything above the larynx here is the supralaryngeal vocal tract, including the oral and nasal cavities. Source filter theory is about 50 years old now, and this theory was really critical to our understanding of how speech is produced in humans. And one really key point is that it is this two-stage process. So as the air comes up from our lungs and causes the vocal folds to vibrate, that causes the actual sound of our voice. So that's the source. And then as the sound travels up through the vocal tract and it's filtered, where some frequencies are attenuated and others are not, that is the filtering process that creates really the quality of the voice that we hear. The other critical part of source filter theory that's especially important for my research is the fact that these two voice features are largely independent of one another, in part because they are anatomically independent, but also they're largely perceptually independent. So you can, for example, be a man with a very low voice pitch but very high formant frequencies, or vice versa. Another way to think about the independence between these two voice features is through a spectrogram. This is a narrow band spectrogram. of a man saying a very short sound, a vowel sound, and the man's voice is 120 hertz. That's his voice pitch. So we have frequency here on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. These really thin horizontal lines are the harmonics of the voice. So if this man's voice is 120 hertz, that's his fundamental frequency, the base rate of vocal fold vibration, and he will have harmonics at integer multiples of the fundamental. So he'll have a fundamental of 120 and then a harmonic of 240, 360, so on and so forth. And these dark bands are the formant frequencies. So you can see again that the formants are attenuating some frequencies and not others. The other point I want to make is that I've taken this man's voice now and lowered it using computer software. So now it's 80 hertz. And what you can see immediately is that the harmonics are more closely spaced. Because again, he has his fundamental here at 80, and now he will have a harmonic at 120, and so on and so forth. 140, sorry. But the other thing to point out is that this does not change the position of the formant frequencies. So again, just highlighting the fact that these two voice features can be independent of one another. So why has research on vocal communication of body size focused on these two voice features among all others? And the answer really is the fact that they are so closely tied to vocal anatomy, and that the vocal anatomy is tied to development and to size. So we know that larger vocal folds that are typically going to be in a larger larynx will vibrate more slowly, and they'll produce a lower fundamental frequency. So we might assume that a larger person is going to have a larger larynx and speak with a lower pitch. And the second fact is that we know that longer vocal tracts, typically measured as this dotted line here, from the larynx to the lips, longer vocal tracts and larger resonance chambers will produce lower formant frequencies or lower resonances. So again, we might think that someone who's taller will have a longer vocal tract and produce lower formants. In other words, we might predict that both the voice features will relate to and communicate body size. And the question is, do they? It depends. The answer is it does really depend. When we are comparing across different species, for example, if we're looking at the vocal features of this gorilla and comparing them to this white-handed gibbon, yes, fundamental frequency and formants both predict variation in body size. Because of course, this guy has a much larger larynx and a much longer vocal tract than this guy, and the differences in body size are very large. We also see that both fundamental and formant frequencies predict size within age-sex classes, between age-sex classes within the same species. So, for example, in humans, men typically have lower pitch and formants. Like I said, the voice is very sexually dimorphic. And they're also typically larger bodied than women. And both men and women will have lower pitch and formants than children, and they're larger than children. Okay, so essentially, both these features predict body size when the differences in body size are big. When we look at other animals and we look within age-sex classes, so for example, in just groups of adult males or adult females, actually we find that formant frequencies do predict variation in size, but fundamental frequency does not. And one of the most popular theories put forth by Tecumseh-Fitch is the idea that this is due to different anatomical and physiological constraints on these two voice features. So the vocal tract is made up of hard tissue, and it's constrained by the size of the skull. The skull, in turn, correlates really closely with body size. So based on this, we know that formant frequencies will be really constrained by the size of the body, but the vocal folds actually develop under influence of sex hormones, namely testosterone at puberty. So of course, when boys hit puberty, they get this surge of testosterone. There are hormone receptors on the vocal folds, and it's that testosterone that really determines the sexual dimorphism and the mass of the vocal folds. And this can happen largely independently of body size. Testosterone and body size are not necessarily always correlated, and so the idea is then that vocal pitch can be independent of body size. What about in humans? It's not so clear, but I think this graph really demonstrates the difference of within and between sexes very well. So here we've plotted fundamental frequency or voice pitch, and here is height. And if you look at this dotted line that's collapsing across both men and women, you see a very strong negative relationship. Taller people have much lower fundamental frequency. But if you then look at women and men separately, here are samples of adult women and adult men, you see that suddenly the relationship is not at all strong. And actually you see the same thing for formant frequencies. So this is the first, second, third, and fourth formant. Again, when you look at groups of men and women individually, these solid lines, you see that the relationships are far less strong than when you're collapsing across sexes. And in fact, if we look at all of the studies that have examined relationships between body size and either fundamental frequency or formants, we see, and I think it's quite obvious from this graph, huge inconsistency in estimates of voice size relationships. So here I've simply plotted the reported correlation coefficient from all these different studies, where 0 is, of course, no relationship. And I've plotted the negative up here because typically most studies find a negative relationship. And you can see that one study, for example, found a negative relationship where taller men had much, much lower voice pitch, very strong, whereas another study found the opposite effect. Taller men had significantly higher voice pitch. And you see everything in between, and this is true for both pitch formants and men and women. And so based on these studies, and I'll get to some ideas about why we might see all this variation across studies later, but based on this, it isn't clear whether either formants or fundamental frequency predict variation within sexes, so controlling for sex and age in humans. To really get to this bottom of this, we conducted a meta-analysis of all these studies. And based on the overview of everything I've told you so far, we made a few broad predictions. The first is that if the human voice has been shaped by sexual selection to communicate body size reliably, the voice might covary with body size in groups of same-sex adults. Because, of course, this is the level at which potential mates and rivals are assessed. So we predicted that, yes, there would be information in the voice at the within sex level about body size. We predicted that the relationship between the voice and body might be stronger among men than women because of the important role of body size in male-male competition in other animals, including humans. And we predicted, based on the anatomical constraints that I explained, that formants will explain more the variation in men's and women's heights and weights than fundamental frequency. Okay, that is an overview. Does anyone have any questions before I go on? Okay. Did you have one? Okay. So we conducted a meta-analysis, as I said, and essentially I looked in the literature for any papers that have any studies that have examined relationships between fundamental frequency and height or weight and formant frequency and height or weight in either men or women. So we were only interested at the within sex level. And this yielded 17 published studies with 44 independent samples, and we also threw in some of our own unpublished data with 8 new samples from Canada, the UK, and Germany. And from this, we were able to get 319 independent correlations between one of those 2 voice features and height or weight. So we excluded 24 of these for one or more of the following reasons. And in total, the meta-analysis included almost 300 correlations. So again, some of these were looking at fundamental frequency and some at various formant measures. And from these, we calculated a series of mean-weighted correlation coefficients. Essentially, what the mean-weighted correlation is that it takes the average of the correlations for a given relationship. It standardizes it and gives more weight to studies with larger sample sizes. So we have 78 of those because, in fact, as I'll explain in a moment, there are lots of ways that you can compute formants, and different studies have done it differently. Okay, so I've already talked about these individual 4 formant frequencies. But as I noted, if we look at all the studies that have looked at relationships between formants and height or weight in humans or other mammals, in fact, there are about 12 different ways that you can compute formant frequencies. And several people have come up with new ways over the past 15 years. And so, unfortunately, it hasn't been clear really whether you can compare across these studies. So this was one of the main goals of the meta-analysis. These are, in addition to the 4 individual formants, some of these formant measures. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about how each of them are computed. The important point is that they are all of these amalgamated measures take into consideration all 4 formant frequencies in different ways. So for example, mean formant frequency is simply an average of the 4 formants. Formant dispersion is a very popular one that calculates the average distance between the formant frequencies. Apparent vocal tract length, for example, is an estimation of the actual length of a person's vocal tract given the formant frequencies and the speed of sound in the vocal tract. So essentially, they all are getting at the relationship among the 4 formant frequencies, or we have our individual ones that look at each formant individually. So again, the meta-analysis, one of the additional goals was to test, is there a difference in terms of how well these different formant measures predict body size, and is one of them better than the other, essentially? What should researchers use if they're going to try to predict body size using formants? So getting right into the results, I've plotted here the mean weighted correlation coefficient. Again, here's no relationship, and the negative relationships are shown above 0. So focusing first on height, and here on fundamental frequency or voice pitch, we found a weak negative relationship between voice pitch and height in men. So taller men had lower voice pitch, but the relationship was in fact very weak. This pooled sample size had over 1,000 men. And I'll talk a little bit about the sort of minimum sample size that you would require in order for this to reach statistical significance. But it was a very large sample required. For women, even with almost 800 women, voice pitch did not predict variation in women's height. Yes?
So is that R collapsing across all those different measures you just showed us? Those are separate R's put?
This is just for fundamental frequency.
Oh, that's for fundamental
Yeah,
frequency.
that's just for voice pitch.
Right.
And then here are the first 4 formants. So this is just the individual formant measures. And in a moment, I'll show the amalgamated ones. First formant was not so great at predicting men's or women's height, but we see that the second, third, and in particular 4th formant frequency were very good at predicting variation in men's and women's height relative to fundamental frequency. Again, just for comparison, I've plotted, you've seen this already, the fundamental frequency relationship. And then these are the 8 additional amalgamated measures of formant. So a few points to make. One is that in general, you can see that all of these different formant measures predicted variation in men's and women's height significantly, and way better than did fundamental frequency. The other point to make is that you see a trend where the relationships are a little bit stronger in men, shown here in blue, than in women. But I'll talk about that in a moment because, in fact, it's not statistically significant. And the third point to make is that we don't see a lot of variation in how well these different formant measures predict men's or women's height. So this is really good news in terms of being able to compare across all those different studies that used different formant measures. But we do have a winner, and for men, that is formant spacing and vocal tract length calculated from formant spacing. That explained about 10% of the variance in men's height. And for women, the best predictor of men's height was the 4th formant. That explained a little less variance than in men. Yes?
I just have a question because it's, somewhat well known that differentiation of pitch, especially fundamental frequency, is highly variable cross-culturally, right? So the famous studies by from Victoria that found that like Swedish male and females have very little pitch differentiation versus Japanese.
Less dimorphism, you mean, between the men and women?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dimorphism, but also pitch differences.
Okay.
And so I'm wondering if all of these are collapsed across different, not only different dialects of the same languages, like Otto and Swan used British English, or I guess in some cases Welsh. What does this tell us, you know, when you're collapsing across so many
Absolutely.
varieties?
I will get to that. Actually, we did look at, there are 11 different countries, and we did look at the effect of country, but actually there wasn't one, surprisingly. So there are a lot of factors that we looked at to try to explain all that variation we saw in past studies, and we thought country might be one, but turns out it was not.
The stimuli and the samples all representing the same vowels?
That's another thing we looked at as well, so I'll get to that. Yeah, it's a good question. So looking now at weight, just briefly, an interesting thing is that we see an opposite effect here in terms of sexes. So now fundamental frequency is not predicting men's weight, but it is predicting women's weight. So heavier women had lower voice pitch than did less heavy women. And if we look at, I've left the first formants out, and these are just the amalgamated formant measures. Again, we see this general trend in which the formants are predicting weight better than is fundamental frequency in general. We see the relationships are a little bit weaker than we saw between formants and height. And the other interesting point is that they're not so much stronger in men anymore, as we saw the trend for height. Yes?
So this is just gross weight, not weight for height?
Yes, this is just weight, yeah. Not controlling for height. In the case of weight, formant position was the best predictor of men's weight, and vocal tract length, again, from formant spacing, was the best predictor for women's weight. This measure came out to be a very good measure in general, and it's derived by David Reby and Karen McComb and used for prediction of body size of red deer. So it works very well in humans as well. The gist here really is that formants explain significantly more variance in men's and women's heights and weights than is fundamental frequency. Fundamental frequency or pitch can explain less than 2% of the variance in men's height and only about 0.5% of the variance in women's height, whereas formants can explain upwards of 10%. Still not that much though, which is something I'll talk about later. And in terms of weight, again, fundamental frequency is a much less reliable predictor than formants. For sample size, we conducted a power analysis to see what minimum sample size future studies would need to be able to reliably predict body size from the voice based on the meta correlations that we got in the meta-analysis. And essentially, this is, again, just driving home the point that the relationships are stronger in formants and that much smaller sample sizes are required to estimate height or weight from formant frequencies than from fundamental frequency. So now getting at your question, we wanted to understand why all this variation and to look at some of the methodological and demographic factors that varied across all these studies and to see whether they can explain any of the variation and the strength of these estimates. One of the key things that varied across studies was sample size. A few studies, particularly the really old ones, had as few as 12 individuals. Of course, not much variation. And the biggest study had only 176 men. So given what we know about minimum sample sizes, even this largest study is not very large. And in fact, in women, none of the samples reached that minimum 99 or 164 women needed. We also looked at the effect of sample sex. Maybe relationships are stronger in men than women, the age of the sample, the geographic location. So these are the 11 countries in which these relationships have to date been examined. Study year in case there were some sort of cohort effects. The speech stimulus, so whether the study measured sounds from, measured these fundamental and formant frequencies from vowel sounds, words, a sentence, a paragraph, or a combination of these. The voice measurement, so the hardware or software used, and also whether the study used direct or self-reported body measurements. So, in fact, I'm not going to spend much time on any of these because first of all, we are only able to look at all these factors for voice pitch. For formants, there just wasn't enough variation in most of these factors. So for formant frequencies, we're only able to look at the effect of sample size and sex. But in general, we found body measurement had a significant effect where the relationships were stronger for studies that directly measured rather than relying on self-report. And we found that sample sex had a significant effect in relationships for weight and fundamental frequency. So predicted weight, fundamental frequency predicted weight in women, but not men. Otherwise, we found no significant effects of these variables. I'm going to focus, though, in the interest of time, on sample size because that was really the biggest factor that could explain the variation across all those studies. And that's highlighted here in these funnel plots. So on the y-axis of these funnel plots is plotted an index of sample size, and the unweighted effect size is plotted on the x-axis, which is essentially the strength of the relationship reported by the study. So all these different points represent a different sample. And I focused on the fourth formant simply because that's where I had the most samples from previous studies, and fundamental frequency. And here I've just split it up into men and women because this solid line in the middle that represents the average weighted effect size, so the true effect, was different for men and women, so we had to split that up for fundamental frequency. So what these funnel plots point out, a few things, is first of all, you see a lot more variation at the bottom of the funnel plot in samples that had smaller sample sizes. Sorry, studies that had smaller sample sizes. As the sample sizes get bigger, you see a lot less variation, and you also see that the studies are closer to the true average weighted effect size. The other thing to point out, there weren't too many outliers. The other thing to point out is that it suggests that there isn't publication bias. If there were publication bias, you would expect to see these studies skewed in the direction of the bias. Instead, we see a fairly symmetrical distribution of studies on either side of this average weighted effect size. So the take-home messages are essentially that there is reliable but, in fact, quite weak relationship about body size in the voice, where formants can explain only 10% of the variance and pitch less than 2. But formants do explain more variation in men's and women's heights and weights than fundamental frequency. And although we saw this general trend toward stronger relationships in men than women, as we predicted, the only significant difference was in fundamental frequency predicting women's weight but not men's. And again, really highlighted the importance of having fairly large samples in order to be able to reliably estimate body size from the voice, given that the relationships are fairly weak. And actually, these same findings have been reported in several other mammals that have very similar vocal anatomy. So everyone's smiling, but I know why you're smiling, Greg. The importance of these comparative comparisons across different species is the idea that, as I mentioned, we have similar vocal anatomy. And so, in fact, many of the predictions, as I noted, that we've taken about whether fundamental frequency or formants will predict body size come from research on other mammals with similar anatomy. So in these animals, so we have Japanese and rhesus macaques, colobus monkeys, elephant seals, dogs, koalas, red deer, and fallow deer. In all of these different species, formant frequencies predict variation in body size, and fundamental frequency does not at the within sex level. So now we can add humans to this list. Okay, so now I'd like to flip sides and talk about the perception of body size from the voice. And of course, I mentioned earlier that just like it may be advantageous for somebody to advertise their body size, it's likely, if not more, likely to be advantageous for a person to be able to accurately gauge size from the voice. So we wanted to ask what information do people use to estimate size from the voice, and are they accurate? And actually there is a huge amount of literature looking at these perceptual associations between the voice and perceived body size. And all of these studies show that listeners routinely associate both low formants and low pitch with large size. Between sexes, within sexes, it doesn't matter. And the finding is incredibly robust. It's been replicated using a variety of different rating scales or paradigms, a variety of different voices, different types of manipulations or combinations of manipulations, and different magnitudes of manipulations. And over these studies find low pitch and low formants is perceived as big. And of course, the media takes advantage of these perceptual biases and has been for as long as I know. One of my favorite examples is Star Wars. Many people may know that the voice of Darth Vader was played by James Earl Jones, but many people may not know that the body of Darth Vader was played by a variety of different actors. In episode 4, it was this man who, his name is David Prowse. So David Prowse is much taller than James Earl Jones, so he fit the role that the director was looking for. But his voice pitch is actually fairly high. And so the director didn't feel that it projected this evil Darth Vader image. And this is a great clip from the Star Wars movie before the voiceover. So here you hear the voice of Darth Vader as it originally was. And yeah, the conflict is interesting. So let's see if the volume is good. Don't want it to be too loud.
I'm tearing this ship apart. Please find people to you find those tapes. Find the passengers in this.
This one is particularly funny.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
And so this is after the voiceover with James Earl Jones's voice.
Commander, tear this ship apart until you found those plans and bring me the passengers. I want them alive.
So that really gets at the relationship between the voice and body as well. Another good example is from The Wizard of Oz, which of course is from the 30s. The wizard had this very deep, resonating voice to project this very scary, larger-than-life figure, and then of course the wizard turned out to be nothing more than an ordinary-sized man hiding behind a curtain. So really this is a sort of folk understanding of low frequencies and large body size that we've known for a very long time. Despite all the literature on the perception, very few studies comparatively have looked at how accurate people are at estimating body size from the voice. Early work that was done in the 70s and 80s by Lass and his colleagues suggested that we are really, really good at estimating body size accurately from the voice. It turned out, however, that they did not do their statistics very well, and when the data were reanalyzed, only about 14% of size estimates correlated with actual height or weight. More recent work suggests that height and weight can explain, actual height and weight can explain only about 20% of people's estimates. And this is if we're asking somebody to say how many feet and inches or how many kilograms somebody is specifically. People are a little bit better if we give them a 2 alternative forced choice task. You play somebody 2 voices and you ask which of the 2 people is taller. In that kind of case, they're around 60% accurate from regular speech. So something, if I have time, I would like to talk about later, but want you to think about a little bit now, is the possibility that the reason people are so inaccurate in body size perception is the fact that listeners may be selected to assess other characteristics that are related to body size, such as strength and dominance, rather than size per se. So I'll come back to that later. And of course, another reason is that we now know there's not that much information available about body size in the voice. This is more of an ultimate explanation. One very common proximate explanation that I'll call the pitch confounding hypothesis is the idea that pitch is screwing people up. pitch is not reliably related to body size at the within sex level. We know that listeners use pitch, nevertheless, and that they're not very good judges of size. And so taken together, the logic is that pitch must be interfering with people's ability to accurately assess body size from the voice from, say, formant frequencies that are much more reliable. The pitch confounding hypothesis has been around for about 40 years now, but it's actually never been directly tested. So this is something that we recently did in a series of experiments. And really, I'm just going to talk mostly about the first experiment. The second and third experiment really were designed to try to understand the results of the first. And for all these experiments, we used a series of different kind of speech stimuli that either contained voice pitch or did not contain voice pitch. One of the speech stimuli types was, of course, your regular modal speech. So this is voiced speech like I'm using right now. You can see that the formant frequencies are present, these dark horizontal lines. And because this is a broadband spectrogram, you can see the fundamental frequency in these vertical lines. So this just represents the opening and closing of the vocal folds. So I will play an example of one of the males in our stimulus set who we had say the 5 vowel sounds in a modal voice.
A, I, E.
I don't know why it cuts off like that.
A, I, E, O, U.
The second type of stimulus was whispered speech. The interesting thing about whispering is that it does not contain voice pitch. So you can test this out by just putting your hand over your larynx and making a voiced sound like ah. You can feel the vibration, but if you whisper, your vocal folds are not vibrating. However, the fundamental frequencies are still preserved. So this is a great speech stimulus for testing this question because we've taken out the pitch and the formants are preserved. And we also synthesized the modal and whispered speech into something called 3-formant sine wave speech. Basically, we just put sine waves at the exact frequencies of the first 3 formants. So again, the sine wave speech doesn't contain pitch cues, but it does contain formant information. And this is a very, very minimal speech signal. Essentially, it's just these 3 sine waves that are present. But because formants play such an important role in speech and vowel perception, 3-formant sine wave speech is still roughly intelligible. It just sounds a little alien-like. But it's interesting because you can still hear the different vowel sounds. So I'll play that for you. It's cutting. And this is whispered sine wave speech. So that is the same man, and I don't know if I played the whisper. So basically, we had a series of men and all 4 speech types, and the question was, are listeners more accurate in one of these speech types than the other? And of course, the prediction is that if pitch does confound our ability to accurately gauge body size from the voice, listeners should, in theory, do better from these red stimuli that do not contain confusing pitch information compared to the modal speech condition, where we have pitch cues that might confuse listeners. To test this, we recorded the voices of 30 men at McMaster University in Canada. We had them say the vowel sounds in both the modal and whispered registers, as you heard. And then we randomly paired these men's voices to create 60 different voice pairs. They were the same 60 voice pairs for each of the 4 speech types. The relative difference in height between the men in these pairs was either no difference up to a big difference of 21 centimeters. And then we performed a lot of vocal analyses to make sure that the voice pitch was not predicting differences in height. So in 70% of the voice pairs, the taller man had the lower formant frequencies, but only in half of the pairs did he also have the lower voice pitch. So this guarantees that listeners can't at least reliably use voice pitch to predict differences in height. We recruited 77 women to rate these voices on body size, and essentially on each trial they heard 2 voices from different men of the same speech type. like modal and modal, or whispered and whispered. And their task was simply to select which of the two voices belongs to the taller guy. And we calculate a mean proportion correct for the 4 different trials, speech types. So to give you an idea of the difficulty of the task, I'll play these 2 voices, and I want you to think about which belongs to the taller man. It's cutting out.
A, I, E, O, U.
A, I, O, U.
Who thought the first voice is taller? And the second? Sorry, Greg, you're wrong. And this one would be a little more difficult.
A, I, O, U. A, I, O, U.
First voice? No, you think I'm tricking you. Second? Interesting. Actually, these 2 men were the same height. So this is very similar to what the participants experienced, except for each of the 4 different speech types. So these are the data looking at the mean proportion correct relative to chance for each of the 4 speech types. So just to be clear, this is the chance line, and everything above it is above chance. And one obvious fact is that listeners were able to assess the relative difference in height above chance for all 4 speech types. So even from that alien-like sine wave speech, listeners could tell which of the 2 men was taller above chance. However, the interesting thing that we did not predict is that listeners were better from the modal speech condition, around 60% accurate, than the conditions in which voice pitch was absent. So this is the opposite of what we would predict given the pitch confounding hypothesis. In fact, we predicted listeners would do better when we take the confusing pitch information out of the voice.
I have a question.
Yes.
You know, for the first samples that you played, I actually thought that the second guy was taller, which he was.
Yep.
But I think my judgment was based on the pace of his delivery. Right. So there's a kind of speech rate effect, maybe. That
absolutely, people
maybe
take things like amplitude and speech rate into consideration, sure. But in this study, we were interested in the 2 different voice features. And then we will look at the underlying features of the men's voices and what listeners were really picking up on and how that affected their accuracy. But we didn't look at speech rate, but absolutely. But there is no evidence that taller people necessarily do speak slower. So this is more trying to get at an idea of whether they're able to pick up on the reliable formant information and whether the pitch affects that or not. Yeah. This is just showing the data in a slightly different way. So again, we have the mean proportion correct as a function of the difference in height between the 2 men. So as you might expect, accuracy increased as the difference in height between men increased. So when the men were not any different from one another, the difference in height was 0, accuracy was about chance, and then it increased upwards of 80% when the taller guy was about 20 centimeters taller than the other. And as I mentioned, we were also interested in looking specifically at the modal speech condition, where the pitch and formant cues were both present, and asking how these 2 voice features affected people's accuracy. So on the y-axis now, again, we have the mean proportion correct relative to chance, but we're looking at this as a function of the different voice features of the 2 men. So when the taller man had the higher formants or the higher voice pitch, listeners were at a chance. They were not able to tell who was taller than the other, or they used the wrong information. And when the taller man had both either lower formant frequencies or lower voice pitch, accuracy went up to around 70 and 75%. Yes?
I'm just curious what the ends were in those different groups. I mean, how often did the taller man have higher formants or a higher pitch?
Each of these, I have that in a table somewhere at the back, but essentially each of them had at least 10 different pairs.
Out of 60?
Yep. Yep. You're right, some had more than others, but usually between 10 and 20 pairs. the effects were cumulative, as you might expect. So when the taller man had both higher formants and higher voice pitch, accuracy plummeted to 23%. So almost 80% of the time they were getting it wrong. And of course, the opposite was true, that when the taller man had lower formants and lower pitch, accuracy was up to 80%. So this is, of course, showing that people are, as we know, using both pitch and formants to assess body size, but it's also suggesting that both these are having an effect not only on perception, but accuracy. So despite the fact that there was no relationship between fundamental frequency and men's height, listeners are more accurate when the taller man had the lower fundamental frequency. This was strange and a little bit confusing. So this is really what our second and third experiments were trying to get at. What's going on? Why are listeners doing better when the pitch cues are present? And why does low pitch appear to be helping them when there is no physical relationship? So one of the things that we had to really cross out is the possibility that what's happening really is not that pitch is helping people, but that there's something with these conditions where the speech signal is degraded. And essentially, it's just that listeners are doing worse here because, for example, when you take pitch out of the signal, formant frequencies are not as salient, or there is something degraded about the signal itself. So we had to make sure that that's not the case. And to do this, we essentially took men's voices, the pairs, and we manipulated the formant frequencies in the voices. And we know that when you do that and you manipulate the formants to be lower, listeners will associate the low formants with large body size. And so we wanted to make sure that they do this for whispered speech as well. So this is now not looking any longer at accuracy, but the mean proportion of listeners who chose the lower formant voice as larger. This is for the regular modal speech condition. So we see at about 75% of the time, the lower formants were perceived as larger. And for whispered speech, there was no significant difference. So again, around 70% of the time, lower formants were perceived as larger, even in whispered speech. So this suggests that men and women, we had both male and female raters, associated lower formants with large perceived body size regardless of the speech type. And the answer to our question of whether the absence of pitch appears to degrade formant perception is no. The absence of pitch didn't affect listeners' ability to perceive formants or the tendency to associate formants with body size. The next question was, so is pitch actually helping people in some way to perceive formant frequencies? And this idea really came from some earlier work on the effect of harmonic density on formant perception. So you've already seen these spectrograms. This is the higher pitch voice, and this is the lower pitch voice. And the lower pitch voice, again, has the more densely spaced harmonics because the integer multiples are more closely spaced. What you can see here is that the formant frequencies appear to be more salient in the lower pitch voice because the spectrum is denser. Essentially, there are more harmonics being sampled at each formant frequency than in a higher pitch voice. And past work has shown that lower pitch actually helps people to perceive different vowel sounds, or it helps facilitate speech perception. And it also, in a very recent study that came out around the same time, affects the perception of formant shifts in synthetic tones. So there is some support that low pitch helps us to perceive formants. And of course, we know formants are related to body size, so this might also help us to assess body size. So to test this, we again took the 60 men's voice pairs from the modal speech condition, where you have pitch and formants, and we either raised the pitch of both the men in the pairs, or we lowered the pitch. And we had two different groups of women rate these voices. So they're the same 60 voice pairs, but some of them are higher in pitch, both the men in the pair, or lower in pitch. And the prediction is that if harmonic density is helping, that listeners will be more accurate when we lower the pitch of all the voices. And that is what we found, that in the lowered pitch condition, accuracy was a little bit higher, but significantly higher than in the raised pitch condition. So again, we're seeing accuracy at around 60% in this experiment. So listeners were more accurate in relative size assessments from lowered pitch, And the answer to the question of whether pitch indirectly facilitates size assessment is yes. Harmonic density did facilitate size assessment. But actually, the effect size was fairly small. Really, we just saw a few percentage points in the difference in accuracy. And given the big difference that we saw in the first experiment, we know that harmonic density can't explain everything that's going on. So this might have to do with something like speech rate. So the take-home message from the perception experiments is that listeners can accurately estimate the relative size of men from the voice using only formants, for example, from whispered speech, but they perform better when pitch cues are present rather than absent. And this is true despite the lack of a robust physical relationship between pitch and men's size in our sample of men. So this again goes against the popular pitch confounding hypothesis. And the other important point is that accuracy increased with harmonic density of speech. So this suggests that there is an indirect facilitating role of voice pitch and size assessment, but again, it's a small effect and it's not the whole story. Looking back at all of the research, a really general conclusion is that the human voice does appear to have information about body size encoded in the voice at the within sex level, and people can to some degree discriminate size from the voice. But we know that formants, which are apparently the best predictor of variation in men's and women's size, can explain only 10% of the variation in height, which is not very much. And we also know that listeners are not very accurate. So really the gist of this all is that the human voice does not appear to be an incredibly reliable communicator of body size, either from the production side or the perception side. Really, one very interesting question that remains open is, given that voice pitch is not related to body size at the within sex level, why is it that listeners associate pitch with size? We know that there is a weak relationship with harmonic density, but again, this cannot explain this very strong perceptual relationship between pitch and size. And one possibility is that pitch is more perceptually prominent than formants. In the study that we did a few years ago, when you equate them perceptually, fundamental frequency and formants, people actually begin to use formants to assess body size rather than voice pitch. However, when you don't do this, when you don't equate the sort of just noticeable difference between the two features, voice pitch is simply more salient in our voices. So it might be easier simply to associate size with that. Another really popular possibility is that people are overgeneralizing relationships between pitch and size that exist in the world, for example, between sexes or in inanimate objects, to the within sex level. We tend to do this a lot in all sorts of perceptual domains. One thing that I'm starting to do some research on now that I find really fascinating is these cross-modal perceptual incongruencies and cross-cultural perceptual biases. The idea is essentially very closely related to the overgeneralization idea that across modalities, there is a very strong relationship between low frequencies and large size. And the final point that I touched on a little bit before is the idea that, and this was first brought out by, or really popularized by Morton in 1977, that low frequency sounds across animals and Ohala states across cultures really give information about dominance and formidability and threat. And so the idea is that lots of people associate dominance and threat with large body size, and so you're just sort of washing over these different modalities. Sorry. So this is getting at the point that I made earlier about the possibility that really what people are selected to attune to in the voice is things like strength and social dominance rather than physical body size per se. So this is something that, as I mentioned, Greg and I are looking into right now is the idea, how well can people assess strength and dominance from the voice, in particular strength. And the interesting thing here is that we know that listeners are able to estimate strength from the voice, but it's not very clear which vocal features they're using or which vocal features correlate with strength. And I'd like to thank everybody and thank you for your time. I think it was exactly an hour. Questions, please. Do I get to choose?
Yeah.
Okay, in the back.
How variable, like how much control does the individual have over how high pitched or how low pitched or how they're...
That's a great question. Yes, voice modulation is a really interesting thing that it's hard to control for in things like the meta-analysis. The short story is that people can modulate their voice pitch quite well by, say, around 40 hertz, and you see actors doing it all the time. And I'm modulating my pitch right now as I speak. But formants are a little harder to modulate because of the anatomical constraints. But yes, people can modulate their voice a little bit. However, there's some studies that look at how voice modulation affects social perception. So for example, if I tell you to try to sound attractive, and I have somebody listen to you and rate your voice on attractiveness, it doesn't seem to affect their perception. So you can fake your vocal frequencies, but it appears that you can't quite fake the assessments that are attached to those. So people can tell you're faking. Yes, I'll go around.
We know that religion and religious perceptions do influence not only the pitch, but also how it changes.
Okay.
So do you, in all of these studies that you looked at or that you tried to assemble in your interpretation here, did you look at religious interpretation with not only as far as monotheistic religions but also non-monotheistic religions? Is that a variable in this study?
In the perceptual studies, no, it is not. We looked at ethnicity. Unfortunately, we have a very homogeneous population of students. These were all Canadian students at McMaster University. There was some variation in ethnicity, but not much. So absolutely, I think it's very important to do this research across cultures and to look at factors like religion, but we didn't look at that, only ethnicity.
How can religion? Because if you speak higher, that relates to modesty. So whether even within...
So this is culture.
Relates to
it's a variable that you control.
But also it has to do with socialization and how you... For instance, if you look at even within Judaism, for instance, or Islam, within certain brands or factions in Judaism, if you speak higher at some point, that has been connected to whether you're modest or not. So that at some point definitely would influence. I don't think that would tell us.
This is not a biological cue. Culture.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, those aren't as separable as you're presenting them to be. So, as Kasia has alluded to, there's work on the relationship between the vocalization that animals make and their position in a dominance hierarchy with regard to appeasement or threat. And modesty is a human version in a particular context of a kind of appeasement, and modesty in the context of religious performance is arguably the most important appeasement for the people performing it. That is, they're interacting with a deity whom they seem to see as omnipotent, right? So these things are not, it's not just either culture or biology that is.
I didn't say that. I say that if you're looking at the body size, I think you're looking to a biological sign. I mean, in terms of
forgive me,
like...
but I continue to disagree. That is, the enactment of social hierarchy, which occurs in lots of social animals, ourselves included, involves the manipulation of signals in order to communicate information. And religious behavior is a particularly complex form of that enactment of social hierarchy. The fact that lots of animals have higher pitch as part of their appeasement displays suggests that this is not an accident that humans do this as well.
Yeah, I agree with this, of course. And I, for example, in my research I also look at culture and biology together as the same matter of research. But if we, as Kasia referring to Oala or Morton, in the vocal signal we have a primary meaning and a secondary meaning, which like I want to appear big because I want to dominate. So I think I agree with you. They are related, totally related. But I think, you know, for example, the religious, it's part of the culture. This is what I wanted to.
Oh, but I can guarantee you, if you take two women from different sides,
they adjust in order to appear.
I'll just finish my point. If you look at Morocco, for instance, which I'm familiar with, you look at the south and the north, you look at two women and two men, and if you, without seeing them, if you try to figure out what their height in relation to their voice, you would get the same monotonous voice. Because Islam and interpretation of Islam, the way it's been socialized and incorporated, it influences the way they produce their discourse. It's definitely a variable.
So you're saying that the shape of their body doesn't influence? Because
at least to the listener, it would sound very monotonous.
This is really getting at your point of voice modulation, and the fact is we can change our voice a little bit, and probably like a lot of animals, we exaggerate our size quite frequently. And of course there are cultural factors. However, there are also these anatomical constraints. So there's a limit to which I can change my formant frequencies, and my body size will predict that limit. And it's possible that listeners can even tune into those thresholds, that sort of range to which you can change your voice. But I agree, cultural factors are huge. Dan, I feel like I have to ask Dan because he's always the first.
And this, to a certain extent, speaks to this most recent discussion, but I want to reframe the perceptual studies that you've done.
Okay.
And that they're not perceptual at all, they're representational.
Interesting. What do you mean?
So the work that Colin and I have been doing for the last few years suggests that people cognitively represent the threat that a potential adversary poses in terms of envision size. And that isn't an issue of perception. So we never actually give a target for perception at all. We just present information about the individual. So there's no visual information at all, or if there is, it's limited to the face, for example.
Okay.
And we can quite readily manipulate people's envisioned size of the target individual. Okay. It would be a mistake to think that what we're manipulating are their perceptions. First of all, because there's no target for perception, and second of all, because perception, all else being equal, should be reasonably accurate. If you misperceive someone's size because you have information about the threat that they pose, then you're likely to fail in your attempts to interact with them in any physical context. So, and this gets at this issue of, well, how is it that, say, a threat display can manipulate perception of sound which should be anatomically based? And the answer is, it isn't. That's not what you studied. What you studied was representation. So you're asking people, which of these individuals do you think is taller? And the question that they're hearing is, which of these individuals is dominant? And those aren't the same questions at all.
It's possible, but how do you know that that's what they're hearing?
Because of the 30-odd studies that we've done that show that
the weapons and
all of
being
that
tied.
Stuff, right,
okay.
Right. You manipulate either the subject or the target,
sure.
And people's estimations of the physical size changes
sure.
when they have no direct access to the individual's
Absolutely.
size.
But I mean, there's no other way to study it. I definitely agree that dominance, masculinity, body size are like this, and that people don't necessarily differentiate these concepts, and that they are largely concepts. But there really is no other way, I don't think, to test whether we can accurately gauge body size, unless we use some sort of implicit cue. But even that could be getting at dominance.
No, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the experiment.
No, I'm curious.
It isn't measuring what you thought it was measuring,
okay.
Or at least the way that you presented it.
But how would you measure accuracy of body size perception differently?
I don't have an answer.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting. I completely agree. Yes.
I have a different question, but quickly adding on to this,
yeah.
On top of all the permittability stuff we did, there's also all this parallel literature on status representation that people like Andy Yap and others have done, which is directly related, and you alluded to with your slide presidents and so on. And I would agree with Dan that even though obviously you are studying accuracy because you're studying accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know the answer and you're checking. It's this point about why, you know, motives people might have for modulating their voice and so on, to the extent that they can, are clearly, it seems like you should incorporate or consider the motives to change the way that they're coming across and being represented.
The context of the situation.
Yeah, and that what they're trying to do is seem not only bigger, but probably more important, or, you know, have that kind of heft. So I don't think that there's any kind of, they're completely complementary ideas, that what you're looking at is the representations people have in their heads, and you can simultaneously look at perception. Yeah, obviously we have a representational dimension to any kind of perceptual event as well, so I don't think those are in conflict. Okay, but my question is actually fairly simple. You situated humans along with red deer and all those other cute animals. To what degree does the data from formant frequency predict body size in other animals relative to humans? Because I'm wondering, these social motives, conscious or unconscious, might make the formant frequency less predictive in humans, and some of that variance could be explained by this modulation?
Yeah. It's a good question. However, I don't think that other animals are any less likely to modulate their voices.
That's a good point. But so, well, how do they compare though?
Yeah, actually I don't know exactly how much variance is explained, but I think it's quite comparable. Essentially at the within sex level, yeah, around 10, maybe 20. Don't quote me, but it's very comparable. Yeah. Very similar constraints. Yes, Brooke.
I'm wondering why you chose to have females judging the voices, given that the setup of this was, you know, about male competition, and whether you would predict greater accuracy if you had, or whatever word you choose to call it, but if you would have male judges.
Right, that's something that we're doing right now. Yeah, we took females in part because that's what's available in the psychology pool at McMaster University, in part from the fact that we've done some preliminary work that suggested there were no difference in men's or women's accuracy of perception. And in the second experiment, we also didn't see any differences between men and women perception. However, there are some studies that suggest that men are more accurate, and that it also depends on whether you're looking at men's or women's voices, which might have to do with the harmonic density. So definitely I want to look at all the different cross-sex relationships, but we were limited in terms of our participant pool to begin with.
So sorry, one other
Check.
question. So I'm just wondering if there may be a Darth Vader effect in that, because you're doing this with Western subjects, where we do have a lot of media representations that do emphasize the link between dominance and physical size. Whether if you went someplace where those two things were not as linked, so if it had more to do with material wealth, or, you know, like the big status guy is the chief or something like that.
Right.
And this may be where it gets at what it actually is perceiving, because if it's about dominance versus prestige or something like that, right, then you might you might not see it if with the chief, they might only be perceiving the differences between people who are actually dominant. But it seems like if you could get away from a culture that seems to
marry the two concepts,
those two things so much, you might be able to piece apart some of those things.
I'd be curious to see if accuracy would be higher in those cases.
I mean, you might predict it might be lower.
You might. I mean, I guess it depends if the dominance is helping them. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any cultures in mind that where the two are?
Well, there's lots. I'm sure any place.
Wolof Senegalese. I said Wolof Senegalese.
Okay.
Is supposed to be, according to Judith Irvine's work from the 80s, it's supposed to be a place where higher the rank, the softer, more taciturn, you speak, and the kind of loose lips, kind of foreigner is all very low status.
Mauritania. A lot of places in Mauritania.
Okay. So similar area.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm looking at right now too is this perception of pitch with space. So in Western culture, people associate low space with low frequencies, but in lots of other cultures, it's actually the opposite. So this idea of high pitch and high space is opposite in some cultures. Pardon me?
Space.
Like actual space. So typically people associate low, like elevation space with low frequencies. And so looking at the idea of, can you tease apart that perceptual association in cultures where it's the opposite cross-modal congruence?
Yeah. Sort of like the sound of music.
Yes, exactly. Yes, do you have a question?
So I totally agree that we use voice in a social context to convey something, and so we can have we can be bigger, use a higher pitch because we want to convey a social status. But if we test from vocalization in a lab whether there has no, for example, no social meaning, we can infer body size. I mean, we can do this. We can do the Kasia research because we just ask to vocalize without any social goal. So social goal, you cannot ever take away social goals from your biology. I agree with all of you. But when you are you are, for example, the spontaneous speech, for example. If you ask someone to vocalize to his modal voice, to his average F0, you can infer biological signals. And I think that this is...
Yeah, I mean, obviously Kasia has done Kasia's research, right? And we're kind of crawling around the edges of it saying, well, what about this and what about that? And, what about because the Ohala predictions are just
about
enormous,
vocalization.
right? No, but they're enormous.
But
So John Ohala's frequency code is about lion manes and about tiny babies and about high-rising intonation that's being submissive, which we know, I mean, at least in the language and gender literature that I'm familiar with, we have a big problem with that. It's saying that females ask questions to be submissive, and the high-rising terminal intonations are going to mean that, oh, could I please, like that. So that's kind of where we're kind of putzing around the edges, right? But obviously, there are constraints, right?
Mm-hmm.
There, babies do drive you nuts because they have a high pitch, or at least my baby does.
Yeah.
I think we're all agreeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, Brooke. Oh no, sorry, I'm not Brooke. Erica.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Dan that, and I mean, I guess you too, because I think you were agreeing with him about the representation versus perception.
I just don't know how to get around it, but
yeah,
I agree.
because I think, the second half, I think the last studies you presented, I was like, okay, so when the things that we think voices, the height differences that we assume to be there in voices accurately map onto the differences in height, then we're better at estimating height, which makes sense if it's a forced choice task.
Sure.
But it wouldn't necessarily make sense if it were a sort of scalar judgment. So I was curious, I had a proposal for an experiment, and it may be stupid because I've only been thinking about it for like a minute and a half. But it might be stupid if I thought about it for like 2 years, who knows. But I was curious whether you thought if you presented, say, images of people or videos of silhouettes or something of people who differed in inch or were the same height or 2 inches or something, having a conversation, or in, just having a vowel tone conversation or something, and you could manipulate the formants between them, and then following that you could ask what is the difference in height between these individuals? Do you think that
so rather than using a 12-term forced choice or even a scale, because we've done that too, a 7-point scale, saying use the visual.
Well,
is that a sort of more implicit? Is that your idea?
I don't think it solves the problem. I understand the design.
The representation would still be there.
So the representation can color the perception one of our experiments, we tied men to a chair and used a laser pointer to have them estimate their heights, and I think that they're 3 inches shorter when they're tied up than when they're not, right? That is, here, their representation of their relative vulnerability in the situation is shaping, in the absence of perceptual cues, is shaping some visual estimate. So if we can get that to work, I'm not sure that this solves our problem.
Okay, I'm not saying that it would be taking representation out of it, but if you're giving them an accurate perceptual cue, you can see these people are the same height, or you can see these people are, one is an inch taller than the other, then you can at least look at the interaction between visual perception and the representational cues that were generated from the voice. Right? So if you have two people that are, approximately an inch apart, you manipulate the formants, and you are perceiving that visual cue as twice as large as it is, how is that not getting a perception?
But it's the same problem. You're sort of misperceiving the visual cue to height based on this association.
Well, then I don't understand what is meant by perception if we're not interested in how perception can be pushed
malleable
around by the representation system. So
yeah, that's a good point too.
I don't really understand what perception
Right, so what I'm trying to get at is the extent to which those judgments are being colored by social facets of the target, independent of their actual morphological proportions, right? So if you were to ask which of these individuals is more threatening, which of these individuals is more violent, you might get very similar responses, and those aren't about morphology at all, they're about social roles. And if the effect sizes are similar between those, that suggests at least that what you're getting here is not perception at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something to think about, yeah. I like the idea of using more implicit task. I don't know if that's more implicit, but in fact, that might actually get even more representative than perceptual. I don't know, it's something to think about. Yep.
So to the extent that, despite the issue Dan has brought up, people are still accurate.
Yeah,
that suggests
that's the interesting part.
that their judgments are based on representations, but the stimuli providers were actually have those qualities.
Yes, well, based on the meta-analysis, we know, right, that information is present in the voice.
And so I'm wondering what. Just in terms of I'm curious where this research is going to go in the future, or whether previous research has looked at cues or really signals of, that people give off, indicating that they're of higher status or that they're comfortable. I'm wondering about things like, does a more relaxed, I'm thinking that someone under scrutiny feels of higher status or more secure in their resources may be more relaxed. Maybe that changes the quality of their vocal cords, or they produce a different, slightly, does that modulate their voice? Does the wetness of if you have dry mouth, do you have does that modulate your formants?
Yeah, there are all sorts of factors, and I mean, I think it would be important to do this work, first of all, across cultures, but also in different contexts. So are people better at perceiving accurately body size in particular contexts, especially in a very, male-male competitive context? There's a research by David Putz that shows that men do modulate their voice pitch based on their perceived dominance of the person they're competing with. So if they feel more subordinate, they will raise their voice pitch to give off this, yes, I know I'm more subordinate message, and vice versa. So I'm curious if in particular contexts you might see variation in accuracy.
I think we have reached the end of our time.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Great questions. Thank you.